So in our first discussion, we focused on the latest edition of your fantastic book, Race, A Philosophical Introduction, which is genuinely one of the most insightful and succinct texts on the subject that I've read. And for this event, I thought we could speak about another one of your research interests, which is deeply related to the topics covered in that book, which is specifically how conceptions of race intersect with issues of aesthetics. Now, you've written about aesthetics in your monograph, Black is Beautiful, A Philosophy of Black Aesthetics. And interestingly and importantly, I think you engage with these issues on the level of content, but more broadly at a formal level. So, for example, one of the most striking and effective elements of the philosophical introduction is the series of short stories which preface each chapter. These episodic narratives feature an African-American man named Jesse B. Semple Jr. in conversation with a young woman, Kwokanani Boyd, and you're going to have to correct me if that is the wrong pronunciation, as Jesse makes jokes about, whose exchanges examine, as Langston Hughes' Simple Stories did, the conflicting views of Blacks and the hypocrisy, this is in quotation marks, the conflicting views of Blacks and the hypocrisies of America's platitudes. Reading them, I was reminded also of Richard Pryor's Duke and Opal, which is, I don't know if you're, familiar with and discussed by the inimitable Hilton Als and White Girls. The stories are very, very funny. They're prosaic and kind of conversational everyday interactions, even the ones taking place during a pandemic. But just like real prosaic everyday interactions, they are also saturated with explicit and implicit conversations about race. So these stories, I think, are helpful springboards into the theory that follows, but they're more than that. And like Derek Bell's Space Traders or Toni Morrison's Beloved or Percival Everett's Erasure, they're doing their own theoretical work as fictions. So I suppose my first question is, what kind of philosophical work do you think these stories do that is not being done by the more literal analytical examinations?
Great, thank you for that question. Thank you for the generous introduction. Thank you also for the kind words you started with. The feeling is mutual. I really enjoyed our last conversation. It's an honor to be in conversation with you, not just because of the richness of the conversation and the brilliance of your insights and questions, but also because you've carved out a path that is frightening to a lot of people who are trained the way we are trained. And you've stepped out on faith in a certain way and found a way to live the life of the mind in a slightly non-traditional way for some of us. And that's really exciting, especially for people like me. Vanderbilt has a long tradition of what some of us call public philosophy. It rarely achieves the degree of public character, the work that you've undertaken, but we aspire in that direction. So it's a real honor to be in conversation with you. To your question. What work are the stories doing? A couple of things, at least. One, and this is slightly embarrassing, I'll begin with it, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to start the conversation where I did. As I say, it's an honor to be in conversation with you because you found a space, some spaces outside the academy to do this work. And I have always, like a lot of people I know, felt some degree of ambivalence about trying to live the life of the mind in the academy. Many of us are familiar with the kinds of tensions we often find between professional, specialized academic inquiry and philosophical reflection. Those things are not the same. They overlap when we're lucky, but they're not the same. And they don't have to be the same. There are all sorts of imperatives on one side in particular that tend to keep them apart. All of that is in the background of this book for me. This was my first book. And at various points, it was difficult for me to convince myself to remain in conversation with philosophers, in part because philosophy hadn't yet figured out how to talk about the things I cared about. So the first edition of this book came out in 2003. Anthony Appiah's germinal interventions, the ones that appeared in book form on the radar of most people, had only just happened. 1992 is when In My Father's House came out in the United States anyway. And so philosophy hadn't figured out how to talk about this stuff. And so there was a way in which I had not found my conversation partners. I had not found a conversational space. There was some. I had mentors and interlocutors, and we were in conversation with each other. But it was a very lonely exercise. And I'm getting to my answer finally. the stories originally were a device that I used to keep myself engaged. I could not make myself write spare, austere academic prose about this thing I cared about if the only people who valued that way of expressing it were the people I wasn't sure I wanted to be in conversation with. I had to find another way in, and Langston Hughes gave me the other way in, right? So that's part of what they're doing for me. Another part of what they're doing has to do with what in some spiritual traditions is called beginner's mind, right? In the academy, in the circles in which specialized academic inquiry is prized and privileged, we sometimes forget where our questions begin. Mary Mothersole writes about this in Beauty Restored. She talks about primitive questions, right? Certain moments in the Buddhist tradition, they talk about beginner's mind. This is the sensibility you inhabit, adopt, and cultivate when you try to remember what it was like before you knew a bunch of stuff, right? Because chances are the things you think you know are blocking you from seeing some other things. And so the stories, when and if they work, are meant to approximate something like beginner's mind. There's a place in the real world where these questions get traction for real humans. And I wanted to start there. And I wanted to insist that each chapter start there. I wanted to root the questions in that kind of concrete or semi-concrete engagement. And that imperative dovetailed very neatly for me with the first. Answering that imperative or answering to that imperative was an additional way to keep myself engaged in the project.
Brilliant. Yeah. I think there is something, I mean, correct me where I kind of move in the wrong direction here, but I take it, I mean, that you're saying that often when it comes to philosophical texts, they are in some ways affectless. So they're not imbued with that emotional meaning that we experience in our day-to-day lives. And that's something which I felt so grounded reading that book, in actually kind of thinking, as you say, about the kind of coming to things before we've seen everything through the lens of theory. And it feels like it's much more, it's underappreciated in philosophy, to the detriment of philosophy. And it does end up with, just kind of methodologically, it feels like it ends up with people going in the wrong direction because they get caught up in all of these esoteric problems and they're not actually focusing on the grounded nature of the issues. Yeah.
And there's also a dimension, I mean, you may find this in your own work. There's a way in which academic specialized philosophy not only sets aside sort of the existential stakes of some of the questions or the emotive burdens in the way that you've described, but also the materiality of the craft, right? In philosophy, just like in any specialized discipline, there are discursive and linguistic crutches that we use. There are expressions that we default to, and the expressions, it's like jazz musicians, when you learn the vocabulary of playing a solo by learning licks and things that other people have done. We let these idioms do the work sometimes, and we decline to notice the way the forms of words we have been socialized into using are carrying the water for us in certain ways. And so there's a way in which cultivating an attention to craft, to the materiality of the writing, to the work of putting words on the page in particular combinations, there's a way that excavating that dimension of the exercise was also important to me. That's in part because I had the privilege of being trained by some really good writers. Peter Kivy directed my dissertation. Peter Kivy's a beautiful writer. He didn't care about a lot of the things I care about because we're different people and we do different things. But we cared about aesthetics and philosophy of music, and he was a beautiful writer who knew how to make the words do work for him without losing the character of the author, the stakes of the enterprise. It was just a beautiful model for me. So there's a way in which I'm trying to carry that forward. And then there's the work that literature itself does, and we can talk about that as much as you like.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I was very struck by in our previous conversation was I asked you a question about how it felt to write these things. And I think the conversation about philosophers as writers, you pointed out, is just not something that people engage in. I mean, and we are writing work I mean, often it ends up exclusively being in the academy, but it's not supposed to be. It's not intentionally exclusionary, and I think that talking about philosophers as writers is something that philosophers, certainly in the analytic tradition, really don't want to do, because it suggests that they're making use of all of these things that, as you say, kind of like run throughout the work, but they don't want to acknowledge. Anyway, so I'm going to kind of like related to that. This next question also has a bit of a kind of long introduction, so I'm sorry about that. But so it relates to the title of the event. The title of this event is A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Post-Racialism, as Anthony pointed out, which is a chapter title from your book. And the post-racial project, as you characterize it, and this is in quotation marks, aims to turn the page on racial history and focus attention elsewhere on the grounds that race is a bankrupt, obsolete, or otherwise unhelpful notion, instead of naturalizing, rationalizing, or politicizing difference like the dominant projects of earlier periods. Postmodern racialism politicizes difference. So it strikes me that contemporary literature is currently struggling over where it stands in relation to the project of post-racialism, especially in relation to issues of authorship and more broadly in the art world, performance. And you say in this edition of Race, a Philosophical Introduction, that the stories have been changed to accommodate thoughts about intersectional analysis in this edition. And I guess I could go into this in more depth, but the general question is it a function of a post-racial mentality to think that a white author, for example, can write a character of color, and that a black man can write a character who is a black American woman? And to what extent is post-racialism shaping the way that we tell stories now? Whether it's, and I know that you've spoken about casting decisions, and you've written about casting decisions and so on. And so, yeah, where do the aesthetic choices run up against the political imperatives?
Wow, that's a lot, man.
Sorry.
Well, I'll take a swing at it, and you can tell me if I'm missing what's of interest to you. So I should frame for the audience in particular the way I think about post-racialism. The first thing to say is that post-racialism, like lots of words, in particular lots of isms, is a word that people use in lots of different ways. And so one of the first things I try to do, I've written about this like lots of people have, is try to map the different uses of the term, right? So for some people, it is to talk about post-racialism as an exercise in the philosophy of history, right? We have reached the end of racial history. The logic of the concept of race has exhausted itself. We know better than to think that stuff now. And so we're beyond all that. We've put all that behind us, dustbin of history, et cetera. For other people, approaching post-racialism or offering a post-racialist philosophy of history is itself a philosophical intervention that needs interrogation and criticism. And the idea of post-racialism can be a critical frame for engaging in that interrogation, right? So for the person willing to use the idea of post-racialism as a kind of diagnostic frame, it's a way of looking at, among other things, the willingness to tell the first kind of story I offered you, right? The frequency with which we hear noises about that stuff being behind us and all that. That is evidence that we are in an age that can be usefully illuminated by a theory that foregrounds some kind of story about post-racialist impulses and that kind of thing. And to say that is not to endorse the impulses, nor to endorse the philosophy of history behind them or anything. So that's just a couple of ways of thinking about it. The crudest way of thinking about it is that to speak of the post-racial is just to speak of a world in which racism is over, post-racist account. Now, there are lots of different ways to inhabit that conceptual space I've just very swiftly mapped. There are lots of different arguments and all that. I don't want to do all that. I will simply declare for you that I think the philosophy of history account of post-racialism is deeply problematic. It becomes attractive to a lot of people at a very particular moment in history for political reasons and cultural reasons that require interrogation. And so I prefer to use the language of post-racialism as a diagnostic frame. And that, I take it, is where your question comes in. Is it useful to identify the pattern of instances in which people do things that seem beholden to a kind of post-racialist commitment, right? If I'm a politician and I say I'm not a Black politician, I'm just a politician who happens to be Black, or I'm an artist and I say I'm not an Asian artist, I'm just an artist. Is that an expression of post-racialism? How does it circulate in the worlds that these two example people inhabit? Those are questions I am keen to ask at a very low altitude. I like to think through cases and then discern the way cultural forces and political currents and ethical imperatives flow through and shape the cases. Is it the case that we could enumerate more cases now than we could have a number of years ago of people behaving in ways that seem beholden to post-racialist impulses? Yes, sure, of course, for reasons that we could analyze and interrogate and talk about and diagnose. But I am not a sociologist, and so I'm not particularly competent to do the broad pattern analysis. I'm interested in the cases and in teasing out the philosophical logic and content, which is why aesthetics is so useful, right? The arts routinely give us these cases, right? A couple of kinds of cases are very important to me right now in my work. One is the kind of case you mentioned. I don't think I do it in this book. I've done it in subsequent writing. I began a story about what some of us now call critical race aesthetics by talking about the Ethiopian Irish actress Ruth Nega playing Hamlet at the Gate Theatre in Dublin, which some people would think, well, that's a crazy thing. Why would you do something like that? But the people who ran the Gate Theatre said this is exactly the right thing to do, given what Ireland is now, and given what Europe is now, and the currents that shape these places and so forth. Those cases, the motivations for them, the reactions to them, the way people navigate them are fascinating for me. For me, that casting choice is not an expression of the problematic kind of post-racialist impulse that we're talking about. It's a recognition that texts like Hamlet are cultural artifacts that circulate differently at different moments, and we use them to tell ourselves stories about ourselves. And the stories we should be telling now are stories that take race and gender and stuff seriously, right? And so it would be a disservice to the artistic imagination and the aesthetic impulse to keep telling Hamlet the same way and to pretend that it isn't being, that story is not being told, depicted, presented in a different world than it was 300 years ago. Another kind of case, and I'll do this briefly because I've been talking a lot, another kind of case that's important to me now are cases that are on the sort of art administration side of the art world, or the nuts and bolts organizational side of the art world. We keep running, at least in the US, we keep running into cases of museum leaders or cultural nonprofit leaders or art organization leaders who trip over the ethics of race and identity, right? The executive director of an important foundation that runs the Indianapolis Museum was recently deposed because he openly, explicitly sent out a call to the constituents and the stakeholders in his institution to affirm that the institution was still interested in white people. Right? We're doing all that, we hired these people and they're doing all this black stuff with black and brown people, but you should know we still care about the white people, which is on some level a sensible thing to do, but it's very strange. And I'm presenting the case in a very crude and swift way. There are details that are important, but these kinds of things keep happening in museums and arts organizations in the US, and they cannot be understood or diagnosed responsibly without some kind of race theoretic analysis, right? This guy was a white guy who had grown up in a world in which race wasn't a thing, and now he was running an organization that had decided to take race seriously, but not really seriously. And he had to navigate all that and didn't have the resources. What he had resources for, the resources he had were resources for recuperating, shoring up, insulating whiteness. And that's what came out, right? And so you have to have race theoretic lenses to engage responsibly in so much of the world we live in. When I deal with cases like that, I feel privileged to do this work. I feel like there's a reason I do this. And so I have the resources to understand and engage cases like that.
Yeah. That's really, really helpful. I guess one of the things that's making me think of is is the shift. And again, we've spoken about this before. This is just my big up for the piece in the next issue of the Philosopher. But this kind of the shift that happens in your work, which I think is so interesting, and it demonstrates the kind of like flexibility of your work between working at a systemic level and thinking about systemic questions, and then working at the level of the individual, and then you've got the local in the middle. And I'd like to push on that a little bit more and think about the kind of accountability of people who are talking about their positionality in relation to the work that they produce, and to what degree it's incumbent on individual actors in the broadest sense of the term. So talking about actors, literal actors, and then also writers and artists and performers and so on, to engage with their position rather than to defer to the industry of which they're a part. So I guess I'm thinking about, for example, Zoe Saldana in the Nina Simone biopic. So I'm not sure, I don't know if she issued a public statement about that, around which there was a certain amount of controversy. And yeah, I don't want to kind of go on. And it's much nicer hearing you talk than it is hearing me talk. So
no, not at all, not at all. So I'll jump in once again. Tell me if I'm going off the rails, and we can move it back on. It is not often that I wish I were an ethicist, for reasons that are internal to the enterprise of academic philosophy, right? Ethics is, of course, an important thing to do. It is an important dimension of human life and experience. The people who study ethics are, in the main, smart and interesting and thoughtful people. Not a commentary on any of that. But the academic enterprise of ethics is something that I've never been invested in, because it does in spades the thing that academic specialization always does. It turns something that started with beginner's mind into something that becomes increasingly narrow, which has to happen. Specialization serves its purposes. But I'm not interested in narrowing those topics into things that only people with PhDs can talk with each other about and 20 people read the articles in the journal. I'm interested in the bigger things. But it would be useful to have more of the language that the ethicists have provided, which is why I'm grateful that they do it, to engage this kind of question. Why did I say all of that? Because for me, one of the basic burdens and opportunities of human experience in life is related to the question you've asked, right? All of life is about adjusting to the conditions in which you find yourself, trying to chart a responsible and intelligent path forward, right? Adjusting to the evidence the world presents to you when it resists your efforts in a particular direction, right? There are different ways to theorize what I just said. The way that is closest to my heart is the version of phenomenology that runs through people like Charles Sanders Peirce and John Dewey. But there are other ways to do it. Another way that is close to my heart that I'm less competent to work through is the way that runs through virtue theory, right? For me, there are basic ethical questions related to the virtues of human flourishing and prospering that bear directly on the issue you've invited us to consider, right? So yes, I think artists ought to strive to inhabit and navigate their environments more responsibly rather than less. But that's just because that's what humans ought to do. Artists might have a heavier burden to carry, because part of the burden of the artist is to engage directly with the conditions of our shared lives. That's what art does. There's a long story I could tell about that using Deweyan phenomenology. I won't bore you unless you want to hear it. But it is, I hope, an intuitive story, right? This is why we have artists. This is why we talk about the moral imagination. This is why John Dewey at the end of Artist Experience says that poetry is more moral than morality, right? Because it's a way of cultivating, undertaken in the right spirit, a kind of ethical creativity that allows us to imagine new ethical worlds and so forth, right? So yes, I think artists ought to do that work because they're human, and they happen to be humans who have taken on themselves the burden of doing some of that work for the rest of them. The Nina Simone movie is an interesting case. I happened to watch the movie finally. It's a terrible, terrible movie, but it's terrible for reasons that have a great deal to do with the industry of movie making. And none of that is apparent on the face of the movie. I had the privilege of talking to some folks who were involved in different stages of the making of the movie, and they had horror stories to tell about how the producers swooped in and made all sorts of weird stuff happen, and they couldn't make the movie they wanted to make. And so movie making is a complicated enterprise that spits out these artifacts that we have to engage. And we can only engage with a little piece of it. Zoe Saldana had to engage with her little piece of it. And she did respond to the criticisms over time. For people who don't know in the audience, Zoe Saldana is one of our most visible contemporary actors, young woman of mixed race descent of a kind that I cannot anatomize for you right now. But she is very lovely in the way that movie actresses are often very lovely. She's brown skinned, her complexion is lighter than mine. She's slender and shapely. And she was playing Nina Simone, someone you would never describe with the words that I just used to describe Zoe Saldana. And some of us thought this was a problem because the way Nina Simone looked mattered to her craft and her work and the public persona she had shaped. She was a living embodiment of a certain kind of critical race aesthetic sensibility that took Black bodies of various kinds seriously. And to have all of that funneled through what was in some ways a very stereotypically attractive woman, to some of us conceded a lot of what made, or gave up on a lot of what makes Nina Simone Nina Simone. So that was a problem. Zoe Saldana heard the criticism, she pushed back on them for a while, and then she accepted them. She said, look, y'all are right about a lot of this. Nina Simone is important in ways that this performance doesn't capture, and yada, yada, yada. So she came to some version of that view eventually. It would have been nice to have that view on the table sooner, but ethical self-interrogation is hard, especially when ethical self-interrogation carries in its train all sorts of implications for my bank account, right? I can take this role and make a lot of money, and for the direction of my career, she's a producer on the movie and she got to do some other stuff. So ethical self-interrogation is hard, which is why these kinds of cases are very interesting and important for me, because they make clear that what is really at stake when we think about race philosophically are the conditions under which and the ways in which we will interrogate ourselves, continue to question ourselves as we take our journeys through the world, subject ourselves to self-excavation and self-criticism in the attempt to live more responsibly rather than less. That's what it's all about. That's what life is about. Race thinking, race theory, racial politics toss up particularly fraught occasions for us to do that, but it's the same enterprise in its way.
That's a beautiful answer. So I'm just going to very quickly, okay, so we have one question. I think that since we started at 7:05, I'm just going to squeeze in very quickly a final question, if that's all right. Abuse my position as facilitator, and then if other people have questions, if you drop them in the Q&A, that'd be fantastic. So I suppose, my final question is quite a specific technical one in some ways, but it kind of like relates to everything that we've been talking about up to this point, and also the fact that this is the 3rd edition of your book. And I think that, it's interesting thinking about how philosophical work and academic works in relation to the publishing industry. And this is both in terms of kind of academic work, but also fiction and literary fiction and so on. And the stories we read are, on the whole, produced within a very, very particular kind of publishing economy. And obviously the university press is a similar one. And I've been talking recently to Darren Chetty and Sophie Anderson, both of whom I think are possibly here this evening, about the obstacles that the industry itself creates to progressive liberatory storytelling or academic discourse. And I think that it's more difficult to produce stories and analyses which engage subtly with issues of race within an overwhelmingly white publishing world. So, and again, this is something that you and I spoke about previously. And it's also more difficult to explore these issues within a framework which, for example, prefers single authorship to collaboration. And I know that I know that we spoke about this before, but I was hoping you could say a little bit more about hope and despair in relation to publishing. Do you think that things are changing, and do you think that things can change? Sorry, that's a heavy one. Yeah,
a heavy one. It is a question I am scarcely competent to answer. The shortest answer is yes, things are changing in the publishing industry. We hear about it all the time. The direction and shape and trajectory and endpoint of the changes, I am not competent to tell you about. Most of the people who do what I do for a living are deeply dispirited by the changes, which I take it as the root of the question in part. So if I were a different kind of person, I would have a complex and detailed story to tell you about the publishing industry and its directions. I don't have any of that. I have the intuitions that we all share based on the stuff we read and hear. What I do have is, and I hope this is what you wanted me to speak to, is the experience of someone trying to find his bearings in the space that is defined by the changes we've just alluded to, right? So the first edition of this book came out in 2003. The world was very different in 2003. I was trained by people who could, in good conscience, train me and just assume everything would be fine. We didn't have to talk a lot about professionalization or how to the strategy for job seeking. All that. We were still in the sort of hangover of the Cold War university, and everything would be fine. I cannot, in good conscience, talk to my graduate students like that anymore. We have to engage the material dimensions of this enterprise in a way that was just off the radar for the people who trained me, by and large. Similarly with publishing, book came out in 2003. I could throw it out in the world and just assume everything would be fine. Now I think harder about these things because I have to, and my publisher encourages me to, and publishers have much more robust resources now for helping authors think more strategically about this stuff. But for many of us, I think finally I'm getting to your question, for many of us that gives away some of what drew us to this life. We wanted to read and write for a living. We wanted to live the life of the mind. We didn't want to think about how am I going to go hawk my book once it's. We wanted to do this other thing, and there is still space for that. There are fewer spaces than there used to be. The spaces that exist are not always as lavishly provisioned as they used to be. The ones that are lavishly provisioned at all, but there is still space for that, and that by itself is an encouraging and enriching and inspiring thought. And so then the question for me becomes a question of how to work with my colleagues to ensure that we do what we can and what we are obligated to do to safeguard and protect the institutions that make living the life of the mind possible, right? So this goes back to what you were saying earlier about the gap between the structural dimension and individual dimension, and then there's the local space. That's one way to anatomize that space. What's in the local space is the institutions we inhabit, the organizations we build that allow us to do the work we do, the organizations we build that provide the resources to make it possible to do the work and to get it out. All of that requires attention and study and scrutiny and work and care and safeguarding. And so many of my colleagues just assume all of that. You cannot assume all of that, right? So I'll stop with this. And this, I think, finally gets to your question. Sometimes we mobilize a language of hope and despair when we have failed to engage responsibly with the work in that middle space, right? When the world presents itself to us in a way that frustrates our expectations of the beautiful nirvana that we thought we were going to inhabit, then we move immediately to despair and we mobilize language of hope to combat the despair and all that stuff. There's some stuff in the middle. There's work you can do. There's work to do. And for some of us, committing to doing that work is itself an expression of hope. For some of us, it is a way of operationalizing that hope. I use language of hope and despair sparingly because people use it very differently in different settings, especially in the wake of work in Afro-pessimism and Afro-nihilism, where the language of hope is supposed to be sort of inherently problematic for some folk. But it might just mean the willingness to act as if the things that you aspire to are possible, even though you know they are not fated to be. There's space between what's fated to be and what's impossible, and that's where we live, and that's where hope is for me.
Wonderful. Okay, that's super, super helpful. So now I am going to stop abusing my position as facilitator and ask some of the questions that have appeared. So first of all, Joanna, thank you for this. Joanna says, thank you for this conversation. One of the sections in your new book is called What the Obamas Meant. Please, can you say something about the philosophical lens through which you understand the Obamas? Thank you.
I can try. I wrote a book about this. If you're interested, nobody read it because I wrote it so slowly that by the time it came out, Obama was out of office, and my publisher was very cranky with me. But it's a little book called On Obama in the Thinking in Action series that Simon Critchley did with Routledge. And basically it's the post-racialist frame, right? So I offer in that book 3 kinds of post-racialist readings of Obama, or post-historical readings of Obama. One of them is he's the icon of post-racialism. Look, racism is over. You got a black president in the United States. That couldn't happen if racism wasn't over. And there are all sorts of problems with that. And then there's some other post-historical readings. One is to read Obama as a kind of post-imperial figure. He represents either the decline of the American empire or the consolidation of a more humane way of engaging in geopolitics or something. And the other is a kind of post-partisan reading of Obama. So there's a whole sort of post-historical thing going on. The post-racialist frame is the one that is most, for most people, most provocative and most intuitive, because that's explicitly the way his rise to fame was positioned, right? He came out of nowhere in a lot of ways and immediately was a thing because, some would argue, he allowed people, he said this himself, he became a kind of blank screen onto which people could project their hopes and aspirations, right? So if I vote for this guy, that means I'm a good person. And so there's a way in which he's the perfect figure for the kind of post-racialist move early on, because for some people, he seemed to confirm the post-racialist reading. Look, this wouldn't be possible if we hadn't made progress. But then later, because the fortunes and aftermath of the Obama administration seemed to many of us to affirm the diagnostic and critical reading of post-racialism. Look, you people were taken in by this thing because there are certain kinds of cultural and political imperatives that encourage you to think racism was behind you and to act as if racism was behind you, because in part, once you do that, you can stop attending to the things that show you the world is still a problem, right? And then you have the return of the repressed, right? Trump comes back, white nationalism, or things that people sometimes call white nationalism, are empowered in ways that one might argue, have never seen, right? And so the folly, the illusion, the fantasy of post-racialism is in some ways openly exposed by the aftermath of the Obama administration. So there's a whole lot to read in the Obama experience in relation to questions around post-racialism and color blindness and racism without racists, to use Eduardo Bonilla Silva's language, right? There's so much there. It's very rich. I think I'll stop there. So for me, the post-racialist reading of Obama, some kind of post-racialist reading is vital, because you can't understand its impact or the aftermath of his, or the aftermath of his administration without it.
Awesome. I think that your publishers shouldn't have been cranky with you, frankly. And I encourage all of the viewers, also audience, to get a copy of this book. It sounds absolutely brilliant. So also, I'm going to move on to next question. This is from an anonymous attendee who says, I recently watched one of these events, which was about Derek Bell. So that would be the last week, I think, with Darren Chetty and Tim Golden. And the speaker, Tim Golden, was skeptical about whether there has been meaningful progress for Black people in the US. So where do you stand on that question? And I guess this comes back to what we were talking about before about Afro-pessimism and Black nihilism and so on.
Good, thank you. These are important questions. I hear questions like these as, at a minimum, actually 2 questions sort of bound up with each other. One is a question about historical interpretation, and the other is a question about existential orientation. Let me pull them apart. The question of historical interpretation is pretty straightforward, right? Or can be, depending on how you approach it. Things have changed. Do the changes embody or manifest differences that actually make a difference, right? So Black people in the United States aren't in slavery. Nobody's going to come kidnap me and sell me into slavery in Mississippi anymore. That's different. It's probably better that that's not the case anymore. But if we take that change to be indicative of some kind of sea change in the character of American culture, then we are setting ourselves up for disappointment. And so the historical interpretation piece of the question turns it into a question that invites us to be very careful about the morals we draw from the manifest fact of change. In contexts like this, I refer often to Amiri Baraka's language of the changing saint. Some people explicitly mobilize this language in response to post-racialist or post-ethnic arguments by people like David Hollinger, right? Some people would say post-racialism as an historical thesis must be true because look at all the things that have changed. You ain't in slavery anymore. To which some other folks, Waldo Martin and others, would say, yeah, things have changed, But it's a changing same because slavery doesn't exist, but race-based or racially patterned exploitation of labor power is still a thing, and it still shapes people's life chances in deep and abiding ways, and blah, 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 right? So yes, things have changed. The degree, shape, character, meaning of the changes is up for debate and requires interrogation at the level of, as I said earlier, low altitudes, at the level of particular cases. And none of those changes, in my view, warrant any kind of sort of triumphalist account of the linear progress of US racial politics, right? It just doesn't. That's historical interpretation. The existential orientation part of the question gets us back to questions of hope and despair and pessimism and cynicism and nihilism and so forth, right? What do you do with the fact that the changes make a difference that in some ways don't make a difference, right? Someone who was infinitely more intellectually talented than I am, the great W.E.B. Du Bois, could not get a job at a white university. Could not. University of Pennsylvania hired him to be a temporary instructor for a year. Then they're like, go to Atlanta University where the Negroes are, right? The fact that I can have the kind of job I have when he couldn't, is change. But as I said earlier, the changes don't necessarily make the differences some of us want them to make. What do we do with that? I've already given you a preview of my answer to that. Some of our colleagues, people who are drawn to arguments in Afro-pessimism and Afro-nihilism, want to problematize the very language of hope in some ways. They want to interrogate the impulse, as I think the most profound reader of Afro-pessimism, Jared Sexton, says. They want to problematize the impulse to delimit the bad news of Black life prematurely, right? They are surely right to do that. You don't want to a priori prematurely delimit the bad news because that will prevent you from seeing what's actually happening, right? But to say that is not yet, in my view, to say there are no grounds for hope. The language of hope cannot be empowering or instructive or edifying or even illuminating. So there are arguments to have about how to navigate that existential space. But once the work of historical interpretation is done, some kind of existential orientation is necessary so we know how to engage with the world that we have just diagnosed and interpreted, right? My interpretation is despair is not an option. Success is not guaranteed. Both of those things can be true, and there is work to do.
Yeah, great. So again, that's very, very helpful. So we've got, so there's the next question ties in very much with that. We've had another one from Brianna McBride. And I'm going to try and incorporate these two together. So I'll read them separately, and then I'll kind of try and put my own spin on them to draw them into conversation. So what are this is Carsten Struhl says, what are the existential dimensions of the issues of racial identity and the discourse of post-racism? So this is what you've been speaking to. How would you interrogate this existential these existential dimensions? And then Brianna McBride says, how do you feel that your work both in Black aesthetics and more generally can be particularly impactful at this time? And I suppose when I'm reading these questions, I'm thinking about the questions that frame the first part of the earlier part of this discussion this evening, and the extent to which culture and writing and fiction can allow us to examine the phenomenology of these situations. And I suppose I was wondering where you would situate thinkers like Ralph Ellison, for example, just to kind of pluck a name out of the air, in doing the work of existential interrogation. So as a manifestation of Black aesthetics, which does important philosophical work in positioning the reader and in conversation with a thinker and a particular phenomenological standpoint. I don't know if that's overcomplicated things, but yes. Anyway.
Good, thank you. So I'm going to try to engage that. Let me start with the questions. The second question was, how do I think my work can be most impactful in this moment, I think is the question, especially in Black aesthetics. The first question was, what are the existential challenges and tensions, that sort of thing, that come with inhabiting or adopting racialized identity? So let me do the second one first. This is one of the reasons I'm often ambivalent about philosophy and about life in the academy. the academy is set up, its imperatives are such that it is in some ways hard to have the kind of impact some of us naively went into this business thinking we could have. You are trained to write for increasingly for smaller and smaller audiences of experts who do the thing you do. Depending on the field you're in, of course, there are ways to complicate what I've just said. But the whole point of the academic enterprise is, in a way, specialization, to talk to experts, that sort of, which runs counter to doing other things for many of us, which is why so many people spend so much time trying to figure out how to get, I mean, people have different catchphrases for this, get research out of the academy back into the streets, right? You do a town gown kind of thing, right? So my work, one of the hopes I have for my work involves what comes next. I have two kind of crossover books in mind, both of which aim to speak to people who may not have the training I have, who may not have the degrees I have, who may not care about the journals I'm supposed to read, but who are interested in the issues that underwrite the enterprises that provide content to those journals. I want to write so those people read the stuff. And so some of the impact I hope to have will come from that. The impact I hope I've already had comes through what is in some ways for me the most encouraging pathway for the distribution of, or the democratization of these insights to the extent that they are insights. Many of us who do this work are also teachers, and the research and the teaching are bound up together. And we can see from the proliferation of appeals to sort of postmodern cultural theory resources in everyday sort of cultural practices that the teaching filters down and the students learn some stuff and some language, vocabulary, concepts, practices, tools, and then they take them out and do stuff with them. They become designers and artists and architects and other things. Some of the impact I hope to have runs through those pathways, and it's hard to tell sometimes what you've done, unless you do the Butler, right, and everybody uses the same words you use, or your students write you and say, hey, this was really impactful for me, which I've had the privilege of having happen to me, a lot of us have. So that's one pathway for the impact. But the other pathway is the work I hope to do soon, which involves writing for a different kind of audience. A third pathway, though, is what's behind my initial praise for Brother Adam and his work. I'm working with some colleagues to build what sometimes in the States we call service learning projects. They're ways of engaging students in concrete interventions and policy questions, ethically relevant policy questions related to race and stuff. So I'm trying to do more of that. So that's another space for impact. And that kind of impact is rooted in a motivation that I find words for in people like Fred Moten and Cornel West. Cornel West wrote many years ago about organic intellectuals who inhabit elite cultural spaces and do the work of non-elite folks from the neighborhoods they started in. Fred Moten writes about smuggling resources out from overdeveloped institutions to under-resourced communities. Some of that's what's at stake for me as well. I'm going on too long, I'll stop there. That's the second thing. The first thing is about the existential stakes. Some of it has just to do with the way race thinking and racial politics amplify the basic existential stakes of living, right? I talked about this earlier, right? The burden, I regard it as a burden of living more responsibly rather than less. That becomes more difficult when the world conspires to tell you that your perceptions are not veridical, that your perceptions cannot be trusted, right? Because you don't understand, because you're the kind of person who can't understand, or because of whatever story you want to tell that's rooted in racist discourse. So some of it is just the basic burdens of living well, exacerbated and amplified by racial politics and imperatives of racist culture. Some of them have a distinctive past to them. These are the kinds of questions that arise in studies of passing. Mella Larson's great novel, it's now on Netflix in some form I have not seen yet. I don't know if it's any good. But there's a reason we keep coming back to stories of passing, because they get at the question of who am I? Who are my people? What can I aspire to? Where should I turn when I am torn between different communities, especially when my life chances differ depending on the path I take? There are questions of integrity, of being true to oneself, of self-integrity, right? All of that is in those very straightforward stories, right? The world says I'm a certain kind of thing. I don't feel like that kind of thing. In fact, the world has given me the resources to tell the world I'm not that kind of thing. I got to inhabit this space of ambiguity and contradiction and confusion, and I have to do it while aspiring to build a self that can navigate this world with integrity? Those are hard. Those are hard questions, right? I'll end with this. Some of the kinds of questions that are particularly pressing for people now have to do with some of the issues in and near social epistemology, right? James Baldwin is my Bible for this, wrote beautifully about this in the 60s and 70s in particular. There are ways in which racist cultures encourage people not to know things that they could very easily know, right? It builds resources and mechanisms that make it easier for them not to know things they don't need to know. It incentivizes not knowing things. It builds epistemologies of ignorance, right? What does it mean to be an agent in a space like that when you know you should know better? What kind of burden does that impose on the ethical agent, right? These first order, second order tensions between the thing I am and the thing I could be. If I just squint right, I can kind of see the thing I should be, even though the world doesn't want me to see. Those are not just ethical problems or epistemological problems. Those are deeply existential problems, as we see in studies of things like white fragility, right? When the perception of the world that I have been encouraged to adopt by a world that is structured by epistemologies of ignorance, when that perception is challenged, I feel that and I respond emotively and affectively because the existential stakes are deep and profound.
Thank you so much. So I noticed that we've got 1 minute left, and unfortunately we've had a flurry of questions as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out these questions, possibly not to answer, but just so that they're out there in the kind of virtual space. So Sophie Anderson says, do you think efforts to work towards a post-racial society are most impactful when attempting to create institutional change or individual change, which is better at leading the other? Candice Delmas says, the Black freedom movement has centered on the spectacle of Black dead bodies, from lynching under and beyond Jim Crow with Ida B. Wells's anti-lynching campaign to more recent recordings of police brutality and #BLM. I wonder what light critical race aesthetic sheds on this strategy and its prospects for success. Thank you. And then we have another anonymous attendee who says, who are the up and coming philosophers and thinkers in your field whose work you find especially exciting? And are there any new topics or themes in philosophy of race which are gaining momentum but are far from mainstream as yet? So, I mean, with 1 minute left, you're more than welcome to offer any answers to that. But I think I think the fact that we've got such rich questions coming out of the talk is a testament to how interesting your work is and how engaging it is to listen to you. And it is a joy and a pleasure to be in conversation with you. So yes, I don't know if you have any immediate thoughts that you want to share on those three questions, or whether it's time and you feel it would be disservice to the questions. Or
well, no, I do want to say a couple of very brief things. It's a great pleasure to be in conversation with you, and I appreciate the audience for hanging with us and offering the questions. I've really enjoyed this. Briefly to the second question. This is one of the things that animates my work in critical race aesthetics. One of the things I'm doing in one of the books I'm writing now is interrogating the gap between spectacular violence, experiences or representations of spectacular racist violence, and our indifference to the routine production of racist or racial vulnerability, right? We're really taken in when things are on fire. We don't pay much attention when we routinely produce vulnerability on the basis of, in ways that produce racial patterns. That's really important for me, and aesthetics gives you a very interesting point of entry in precisely the way the question notes. Very quickly on the first thing, one of the things that's important for me in thinking about, oh, I completely lost the thread on this one. I've forgotten what the first one was. Can you remind me?
Yes, I can. So it was Sophie's question about, do you think efforts to work towards a post-racial society are most impactful when attempting to create institutional change or individual change? Yes.
Good. But one of the things I didn't say when I offered my initial framing is that the idea of post-racialism is a member of a family of concepts that operate in sort of similar ways, but have different ethical and political valences, right? So it's part of a family of concepts with notions like deracialization from political science in the US, non-racialism from political struggles in South Africa and theoretical engagements in South Africa. There are a handful of notions that work like this. They do certain kinds of similar things, but when the language of post-racialism is mobilized in ways that look more like what people argued for in terms of non-racialism in South Africa, that can be very powerful because it's wedded in part to a very robust and profound class critique, right? It's a story about how, I mean, it's an intersectional story about how race and class are bound up with each other, and now it's about the production of immiseration in certain kinds of ways. It's not just the sort of superficial thing that, if you'll forgive me, animates, I suspect, Tony Sewell and his commission report, but you all can tell me if I'm wrong about that. So post-racialism is one of these essentially contested concepts people use in different ways. Sometimes they use it in ways that look more like non-racialism in South Africa, sometimes does, and that can be really profound. But in part because the transformation is explicitly imagined as societal transformation, but it's bound up in ways I suggested earlier with individual self-critique and self-interrogation. They have to go together.